Come on, Tony. You can understand me a whole lot better if you just pay attention to my knife. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just doing a little bit of role-playing for some fiction I was doing here. Welcome to the dungeon again, and my little writer's pit where I create some of the darkest fiction on the internet. I was just going over a section of writing in my latest book, SEETHINGS, whereby a relationship counsellor is having to spend some seriously good counselling time with one of his patients. He's been made to cancel all of his appointments and just deal with a situation that's occurred in his office. He's tied up to a chair and been made to listen to a story. Mitchell Felding, who's one of his patients and is having a really hard time at life, is telling him, or about to tell him, the events to a very major story. But in order to get to that point, he has to push Tony to his limits, psychologically speaking. Mitchell Felding has a theory that every mind has a breaking point. You just have to have the right situation for it to occur. And eventually it will let go of reality and create a new reality of its own. Psychologically, a psychological thriller, right? That's what I write, so obviously that's where I'm going with this. But Tony says it's called situational dissociation, which is the term that most of the medical fraternity use for people who basically can't take hold of this reality and invent other things in place of it. Situational reassociation is what Mitchell Felding is using as a term to explain what's been occurring in his life. What he wants to do is get it to occur in his counsellor's life momentarily to establish and make a point. So what he does is he takes a large knife, a knife that he brought to the counselling session but kept in a bag, and he waves it in front of Tony's face. And there are lots of descriptors about the reflection and the shiny edges and what can be seen in the knife. And there's lots of metaphors going on at that particular time. But then, without warning, Mitchell turns it over like that and walks past his counsellor's arm and just runs it across this area here. And it opens up a big gaping wound and it starts to bleed. And so the tension has been building in this scene, and it kind of is punctuated with this. And suddenly the counsellor's head rolls around a little bit and things become awfully foggy, and it's not because he's losing blood and losing blood pressure, it's because he's been taken to a mental state that exceeds anything else he's ever had to deal with. And so the room starts to become fluidic, and the knife, I'll just read the section out to you. The knife slowly floated past me in free space, wobbling and bending as it went. It smiled at me. Several of its knife friends joined it, and they smiled too, hovering about in the room before me. I didn't know where they came from, but it didn't matter. They weren't harmful, not at all. They floated in a sea of silvery fluid. The knives morphed into fish, and then they became tiny ladies in chrome bodysuits. They held each other's hands and played together, swimming around in a synchronized routine. I watched the entrancing performance, those supple little bodies frolicking together, floating in their mysterious silvery sea. Why was I smiling? Did I really see them this way? These chrome ladies swirling about in mid-air? Then I heard a voice in the distance. Are you quite finished? And so at this point, Mitchell Felding brings him out of this little trance time and says, look, you were somewhere else for a very short period of time. And Tony denies it. He says he was in charge of his faculties, his mental faculties, all throughout this tormentuous moment. And then Mitchell then says, where does he say here? What about taking a look at the clock on the wall? I lifted my eyes and I looked at the clock on the wall. Half an hour had passed since I'd last looked at it. How did that happen? That can't be right. And I bet you're wondering where the time went, he asked. You changed it. Me? But you would have seen me. See, in the counsellor's room, there's a clock directly opposite the counsellor. Every counsellor measures their sessions. It's something that they have to do in order to make sure they don't run over time. So, and this is set up earlier on in the scene, earlier on in the book. So, we know that Tony's been watching the clock, and suddenly there's half an hour that vanishes. Unexplainable. And Tony says, well, you changed it. And Mitchell replies, well, you would have seen me do it. The clock's right there. I'm right here. You're facing it. How can you explain not seeing me do it? And so this goes on for a little bit longer. And there is also one other element that comes into play as well, but it's in a different chapter. Something else was done. Something else happened during this half an hour break. So Mitchell Felding leans in and touches his forehead. To mine. I asked you to give me an example of what would happen to a mind if control was taken away, and now you've given me the perfect example. Frightened now, I looked at him, whimpered. He stood up and patted me on the shoulder, and he said, don't worry, big fella. It'll all come back to you in time. I'll make sure of that. And he does. In a later chapter, he makes sure that Tony knows everything that occurred during this period of time. And I guess when you're writing psychological thrillers, you do have to have these mental slippages, slight changes in realities, not knowing which voice is doing the talking, and then putting the puzzle together at the very end, and trying to make sense of everything, and wondering, is this the real ending, or is this an alternate ending that the character thinks he's thinking about, or she's thinking about? Anyway, so I just thought I'd give you a little insight as to what's going on with Seethings in this particular chapter, and the kind of work that gets done behind the scenes to develop a story such as that. The knife is used as a metaphor. Earlier on in the piece, there are lots of descriptors, because basically when you see a knife presented in any particular scene, it's usually for threat. There's a threat. In my books, there's no stabby stuff. There's not a lot of blood. In fact, this is the only scene where there's blood. Oh no, there is a later scene where there's a little bit of blood, but it's consequential to something else that's going on, which is there's no blood and gore in my particular scenes in the horror sense. It's more mind control and physical application rather than shooting and stabbing and cutting and all that sort of business. So I don't do any of that, except for here where I needed to apply pressure to an outsider to the story to create a stressful scene. All right, well, that's about it from the dungeon. You can come back anytime you like and have a look and see over my shoulder what I'm writing, what I'm talking about, how I see the world, and what I like to write about. You can come to my YouTube channel, that's how you found me, no doubt, or to my website at www.mfp.com.au/yourthroat. You can also go to my podcast at the Dirty Rabbit Hole podcast. It's an extension to the dungeon, Dirty Rabbit Hole. You know, when you're writing, you go down a rabbit hole. Well, this one's a dirty one, so that's the connection there. And as I said, come to my website at www.mfp.com.au/yourthroat, all one word. Well, that's it for today. I'm going back to see what I can do with Tony Brindell, the counsellor. Come on, man, you can do it.